4 out of 5 people with asthma are using their inhaler wrong right now. That's one of the biggest reasons why people end up in the ER with an asthma attack. My guest today built an app that tells you exactly what's in the air you're breathing, how it's affecting you, and what to do about it before the symptoms even start. You're about to find out why your allergies might have nothing to do with the season, what's actually in wildfire smoke and Saharan desert dust, and why your neighbor's lawn spray might be affecting you more than you think. I'm talking with Eric Klos, the founder of the Daily Breath app, built after watching his sister struggle with a condition that the weather kept setting off. I know you have an app called the Daily Breath. Could you help us understand what led you to create that and what it is even?
Sure. So my sister had rheumatoid arthritis. She was living with my family at the time. And she came down one morning with you end up having stiff joints. Fingers usually are very gnarled. And she said, Eric, it'd be interesting if there was a mobile app that told you when the weather was changing. And she knew inherently that barometric pressure changes, maybe precipitation, humidity, ups and downs, various things like that were having an impact on her rheumatoid arthritis. So for me, it was the light bulb went above my head and said, oh, environmental health. And I call it environmental determinants of health because you have multiple determinants of health, your genetics, medical care, social determinants of health. Environmental determinant of health sometimes get lumped into social determinants of health, but it's really a separate category. It's only about 10% maybe, but obviously more substantial potentially now than maybe in the past. So that's where I started my kind of intellectual curiosity around, okay, well, what type of conditions are most impacted? And back then, it was really respiratory, cardiovascular, arthritis and joint pain, and migraines and headaches. Now, in the interim 8-9 years, I think there's been a lot more research done. And so we know that pregnant women are impacted by PM2.5 particulates from wildfire smoke. There's been some correlations there. Children and elderly are significantly impacted differently because of their vulnerability, their susceptibility. There's been some advances in that, but those were the 4 that I focused on. And I started with asthma and allergies. About 6 months before I really launched my first prototype, there was an article I read on the internet that said, and I'll describe what it said first, and then I'll describe the story. It says, doctors trying to pinpoint triggers for 15-year-old girl in ICU. And what it laid out in the article was a story about a young girl, 15 years old from Nebraska, who went to Iowa to an amusement park for the weekend with her family. Probably went out during the day, hot temperatures, high humidity, and July 4th weekend. And out in Iowa, probably pesticides in the air, various types of pollutants in the air. We don't know too much about how that impacted her, but she went home that evening, had dinner with her family, came back to the hotel, and she went down to the hotel pool. And hotel pools historically have lots of chlorine, right? And chlorine for people who have asthma can be a very toxic irritant. She had an asthma attack and she was down for 20 minutes. Obviously, they sought emergency assistance and she ultimately came to the hospital and she was in a coma. When she came out of the coma, she was a paraplegic. And unfortunately, I read a story last year. This was in 2017. She was 15. So last year she passed away at 24. So it's a premature mortality from what I describe as potentially preventable asthma attacks. And those are the stories you don't read about. You'll read an article about someone dies of an asthma attack, but you very rarely read about the one that maybe is a paraplegic. Mother has to quit her job to take care of the child or the teenager in that case. Unfortunately, I see the stats all the time and it's kind of hard because it's like, this is just not another stat. And these are people, these are lives. That was my inspirational moment for we need to pinpoint triggers, not after the fact, but before people experience them so that they can protect their health. So that really was the inspiration for Daily Breath. And so what Daily Breath tries to do is collect that environmental data. And I have something called impacts and recommendations. So what are the impacts? Because there's lots of correlations between weather variables and pollutants, right? So hot temperatures and high humidity create much more dense pollutants, and those are more easily inhaled into your lungs, and therefore they're more impactful. into your breathing. The idea is to have those impact summaries and then some recommendations. What am I going to do about it? I like to say daily breath is really about answering three questions. What's in the air that I breathe, right? How does it impact my health, my personal health? And what can I do about it? And so that's what we're trying to answer with daily breath. And the biggest challenge from the beginning has been, where is local environmental data? What
Well,
do
that
we
was going to be
consume?
my first question is where do you get the information and how are you able to pinpoint it to where that person is located?
That's been the fundamental challenge. When I started this, again, you have a certain amount of naivete thinking, well, yeah, they're tracking air quality around you. So when I started to do the prototype, I did EPA Air Now data, which is basically 125 to 150 stations across the country, the entire United States, but 150 of them. And what they do is they extrapolate that data into modeled estimates for air quality, and they give you something called an air quality index. That reference model is 5 kilometers or 3.1 mile data. And that's taking a reference station that, in my case, is in Silver Spring, Maryland, okay? Which
Which
is
is
the
how
cover
far away?
slide, about 15 miles.
Oh, wow.
It's the most local station. But what they're doing is taking all of that data and then trying to estimate or model it at that 5 kilometer, 3.1 mile data. So obviously, you incorporate what you can. I've always said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You've got to take what you can and consume that information. There's a lot more models that are coming out that are trying to get that estimated model more and more local. And then there's new plays out there like mobility-based sensors. So they travel through a city on fleet vehicles like a postal service or an Amazon trucks or taxis. And those can get down to the 1 meter level data. Now, again, they have to compensate for their traveling on roads, right? So they're going to have a different interpretation of the pollutants that they're actually getting quality readings from. And so that's a little bit different. What I'm working on right now is there are now wearables emerging. And so that's a wearable air quality monitor that goes on your person. To me, that's ultimately where the market hopefully is going, is the most local environmental data so that it's personally relevant to you. And then you can start to track your symptoms. That's what the app does. It tries to track acute symptoms. When you start feeling the early onset of an asthma attack or asthma symptoms, you would record that and try to correlate, well, what types of variables and what type of levels are impacting you. We have a kind of a rudimentary AQI that says good, moderate, unhealthy for sensitive groups, unhealthy, and then very unhealthy, and then hazardous. But we don't really know what's my threshold. I may not be a sensitive group, but am I falling under this category?
Another thing that strikes me is even if we don't have asthma or allergies, we're still being impacted by the air pollutants, right? I'm thinking about a couple of weeks ago, we were having smoke here in Vermont from the wildfires in Canada, and you could see it visibly. And I wondered, I mean, obviously the people that have asthma and allergies are going to be more vulnerable, but I wondered about what are the impacts on the average person? And also when you see those weather alerts, are they actually tracking my specific area or are they doing kind of a general thing like you were
Right.
describing?
Yeah. And so two things that you mentioned there. So one is the one maturation that occurred before 22 when I basically really launched it as a go-to-market version to both Google Play and Apple App Store was I realized I didn't want to get pigeonholed as an asthma app. I wanted to be the first health app that tracked the air you breathe and your health, because that was the development that had occurred. I was looking at it going, okay, I want to track acute symptoms, but you know what? I want to track how people are feeling each day. So one of the unique things, I have a new version of the app coming out in August, September timeframe. And where I've pivoted, I have a daily breath check-in. And what it does is it asks, how is your breathing today compared to yesterday? And it says better, same, or worse. And if you say worse, because I'm gathering yesterday's data and today's data, I could look at a pollen count and say, hey, pollen count is higher today by 25% and give that result back to you. So you begin to feel context. The biggest thing, as you described, right, It's really this invisible variable where there's no context. There's nothing that makes it personally relevant to you. So at least at the minimum, you want to start to kind of track these environmental exposures and provide context to them themselves. But ultimately, what Daily Breath is aimed at doing is trying to correlate your health experience, right? I want Daily Breath to be a platform that helps you build your personal environmental health record. And maybe somewhere down the line, that's a record that you actually can bring to your doctor and say, hey, listen, I'm noticing that I'm allergic to trees because I've been having symptoms on these days. Maybe I should do allergy tests to
Yeah.
determine I'm allergic to.
I'm wondering too, I seem to recall that there's some sort of device you can wear around your neck on an airplane that actually filters your air. Do you know anything about that?
I do. So,
Ah, because I was thinking that would be a great tandem product to go with the
so
app.
yeah. So what you're actually talking about, it's called the Respirate.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So this is the actual air purifier. So I call it a wearable air purifier. And you basically just put it on and then it starts to pull in poor air and then exhale good air. Now, most people are looking at it from a travel perspective and more from almost a post-COVID perspective. They're thinking of infectious diseases and stuff like that, but they are pitching it from an allergy perspective, allergy relief.
So does it say what level it filters out various different things?
I'd have to look back at the actual website to see what they're claiming, but that is one of the things. And I'll talk a little bit about this, but the air quality industry is very fragmented from air
Mm.
quality monitors to air purifiers.
Huh.
There's a whole range of things and they're proliferating in great abundance, but there's really no certifying authority or
Oh,
governing
that's not good.
authority. I think that becomes really challenging because
Yeah.
it tends to look like it's almost like a car salesman type environment, right?
Yeah, and if you can't
And
really trust that this device is gonna do what it says it can, it kind of makes me think of the same challenges we have with food labels that make all or not just food labels, but all kinds of product labels that make all sorts of claims, but then if there's no certifying or independent agency that can confirm that those claims are true, how do we trust?
right. Well, and the one thing that I think is interesting is so Daily Breath functions really in three ways. It's a platform for environmental health intelligence. It's a solution ecosystem. So what I'm trying to do is again connect those recommendations. So I sell masks on the Air You Breathe store. So I sell masks, the Respirate, a couple air purifiers at the Atmo Tube wearable air quality monitor, bunch of different things. And the challenge here is it's like, first of all, one size does not fit everything, right? It's a cacophony of solutions that you have to figure out what works, right? But the other thing I'm trying to do with Daily Breath is actually create a model where it's kind of has a couple of things in it that can actually track your intervention. Hey, you had this air quality before, you implemented this intervention, let's say an air purifier in your bedroom. And now your PM levels have gone down.
It's
Well, you can
showing real world results from whatever that intervention is. I like that idea.
exactly, exactly. So that would be like if we have plans to Bluetooth enable the app so that you can connect to this wearable air quality monitor. So now you're basically having that on in your bedroom and you're taking readings the week before you put the intervention date and then you figure out, oh, afterwards, actually, there was a reduction by 25% or 50% in the PM levels in your bedroom. So that's what we're trying to do is really change the entire way we're approaching environmental health. I call it personalizing public health because we viewed this as a public health matter. And what that means is the data that we're consuming is more at the community level or the regional level. It doesn't make it personal. And then I think, as I mentioned earlier in our discussion before the podcast, what we're really trying to do is kind of connect people to the issue. The issue is very prevalent, but people talk about policy and regulation. It really doesn't feel connected to people. So what Daily Breath was aimed at doing is first being something that you can use to protect your health. That's on a personal level, right? But if you know it's affecting you personally, you're much more motivated and empowered to actually support policy and regulatory action in your community that ultimately is aimed at reducing industrial pollution or greenhouse gas emissions or anything like that.
So you've been having this app for how long now? Daily Breath for how long?
Well, most recent go-to-market version came out in 22,
Okay, so about 4 years-ish.
about 4 years.
And so typically the people that are signing up for the app, are they people with asthma and allergies, or is it other folks too?
Tends to be asthma, allergies, and COPD seem to
Oh,
be the
right,
most.
COPD. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because again, it's exacerbations and asthma attacks. And, the other thing, again, the reason that is to a certain extent, at least in my opinion, I went down the allergy and asthma path as I described to you, and the receptivity in the allergy and asthma community from a medical practitioner perspective was not there. It wasn't there. I mean, my son even had the experience when he had symptoms down at college. When he went in, they gave him a singular pill, which is something he can take on a daily maintenance perspective, and gave him a rescue inhaler. And that was it. And that was their response. That's a real challenging environment. And what I've tried to do is say, listen, there's a perception that there was a woman who had a 2-year-old infant that died of an asthma attack. And her comment was, I didn't think someone could die of a condition that was being managed by medication. And so that's a really glaring insight into, wait a second, you actually thought just because the child was taking a controller medication, nothing was going to threaten them. And it's like, no, every asthma attack is triggered by something.
Right, and my guess is that she felt like she was doing what she was told to do to manage the
Yes.
symptoms, but not really figuring out what, first of all, caused the problem and what are the contributing factors that are keeping it going that the child had to take medication for.
That's exactly right. So, again, when I see these things, I tend to have two questions. Again, just like you said, mold in the home. There's a whole range of issues from a trigger perspective that could be evaluated. Now, the secondary issue too, and again, as I encountered the issue of asthma and COPD, they depend on something called inhalers. Okay. And what that means is you're trying to breathe something into your lungs, medication that goes deep into your lungs and modifies your airways in a way that can allow you to breathe. Okay. Well, there's a statistic out there that 50% of all usage of inhalers, whether it's a controller medication on a daily basis or whether it's a relief or rescue inhaler, is incorrect. So people don't know how to use their inhalers properly. And this becomes very important. Why do we have so many asthma attacks in the US that lead to ER visits? It's because they're not using their rescue inhaler properly. I always laugh. What is our experience with inhalers? It's the Big Bang Theory with Leonard using his inhaler, right?
I love
That's what
that
people
show.
think about. Well, he does it like 4 or 5 times,
And you're not supposed to do that?
right? No.
I
If
don't
you're
know
if
anything
you're
about how to.
using your inhaler properly, you should be able to prime it and use it once or twice to get
Oh,
it
wow.
back into your lungs, and it should be fine. If
Wow.
you've got to do this 4 or 5 or 6 times to relieve it, it means you're probably not using it properly. Okay. And the fact that we have so many ER visits from asthma is because people are not getting that, emergency medicine. I call it AED, right? We finally are now getting inhalers in schools because it's really not much different than somebody who is having a heart attack. You have a defibrillator device to basically resuscitate them, right? Well, same thing comes with respiratory distress. And respiratory distress, you can tolerate 3 minutes without breathing before you have serious implications,
Yikes.
right? And so that's why it's such a critical issue.
And so as I'm thinking about what you're talking about, I'm also aware of all the different things that we bring into our home. Of course, being into green living for 34 plus years, I'm thinking about some of the triggers, the irritants that we're using without even knowing them. A lot of times the air fresheners, the plug-ins, the products that have a
Right.
lot of perfumes and fragrances, including our laundry detergent, all of those things can
Yep.
add more problems for somebody that's already experiencing trouble, and then it can also lead to potentially people having trouble that maybe didn't
Yeah,
initially.
absolutely. And I think that, again, these are things that we're discovering when I talked a little bit earlier about this book called Dust, which talks about literally the advent of modernity in society. And what did that mean for the creation of various pollutant sources, whether it's outdoors or indoors, right? Our built environment, there was no perception of if I build a desk or if I build a sofa for your living room, what are all the types of chemicals and things that are in those that actually are off put into your environment,
Right.
volatile organic compounds, right?
Right, like the new
From
carpets and the paints and the stains and like you said, the
yeah,
furniture, like, particularly people's beds. If you think about you are sleeping on a bed that's releasing chemicals into your air. One of my
right,
early experiences when I first moved to Vermont, I was hired by the co-founder of Seventh Generation to lead something called the Household Toxins Institute. And we were going to hire toxicologists to actually test, starting with the natural products, but to test to make sure that they were actually meeting the claims that they were making and then get into all the
right.
conventional stuff. And I wish that that had actually happened, but unfortunately it just didn't take. But I think that there's a real blind spot for folks not realizing that they actually have control over a lot of these things that they can be not bringing into their home and choosing safer products. But I want to get back to the part you were starting to talk about as far as community. Have you seen anything through your app or beyond that as far as people working in their community to try to reduce these types of toxins outdoors?
Yeah, we don't really have enough evidence right now. Since the beginning, inception, I've had 90,000 downloads. That's actually not bad from a health perspective. I was reading an article that said only 7% of 200,000 health apps have more than 50,000 downloads. We have a lot of downloads. We have about 17,000 registered users. We also have a community symptom map where people record their symptoms and they're crowdsourced. So you can actually see where people are experiencing symptoms. So once we start to develop more critical mass, my sense is that will be a very interesting map to look at because really symptoms are a proxy for pollution or allergens in your community, right? And so the goal would be, hey, if we start looking at crowdsourced symptoms in a community, we can start to develop an understanding of hotspots in our community. So think of it in terms if you wanted to develop a green barrier between, let's say, a highway corridor and a school, right? Because unfortunately, where do we build schools? We build schools next to tree lines and highways for whatever reason. But it's crazy. So I do think there's an opportunity from a green living perspective and a perspective of climate change mitigation activity or clean air activity within a community for us to identify hotspots and figure out, okay, here are areas where we should implement things. And potentially then can you use an app to track, like Daily Breath to track, okay, there's been a reduction of symptoms in that community or a reduction of actually you're seeing improvements in air quality in those communities. But we just don't have the maturity around data. It's always the data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think we've got the data, we've got the information. I'm not sure we've got some early stage knowledge where we're trying to provide alerts to people. Again, I don't think they're personal, so I don't think that makes them as relevant. And then really the wisdom is you understanding personally, how are you impacted by not just pollution in general, but how are you impacted by nitrogen dioxide or ozone or a specific allergen? Most people think of, oh, I have allergies. They know they have tree allergies if it's the spring. They know they have grass allergies if it's the summer. They know they have weed allergies if it's the fall. But the fact of the matter is you're allergic to a specific type of tree, right? And you may only be allergic to that type of tree because you've been exposed to it because you've lived here for 30 years. You happen to go to a conference down somewhere else and you're fine. You don't have the allergy. Or you have the obverse, which is you're not allergic at all. You go to Atlanta and suddenly you're allergic to something, right? And you experience symptoms and you're like, well, what happened down there? It's because you're allergic to a specific tree that's in Atlanta, right? So these are the kinds of things that people, they're just not aware of. They don't understand there's that level of specificity
Yeah.
to allergens and pollutants that they're vulnerable to.
I was just thinking about, wouldn't it be amazing if we had a real-time app, I guess it would be, where if you saw your neighbor was spraying pesticides on their lawn or their trees, and you could basically report it without necessarily reporting them, just reporting that there's pesticide spraying near you. That would
Right.
be really interesting to see how that might track and to see if people had more symptoms as a result of it. Because one of the things that happened early in my career, I lived in Massachusetts before Vermont, and I lived in
Mhm.
this little seacoast community. And we found out from the state of Massachusetts that it had three types of cancer above the state average. And everyone started to panic at that point. And I had already started a little bit primed the pump in that I had been writing letters to the editor of the newspaper to let people know about all the discoveries that I had made
Mhm.
through mostly initially from its non-toxic baby book when I was pregnant that was talking about all the
Mhm.
different toxic chemicals in everyday products, including baby products.
Right, right.
But the thing that was so disturbing was that it was really hard to find out what could possibly be causing these cancers. The only thing that we really were able to isolate was there was a lot of pesticide spraying because it's a pretty wealthy community that I used to live in, and people were addicted to weed-free lawns. And so if you wanted to have an organic garden, but somebody next door was spraying had a tree service or a lawn service spraying, good luck to you. It would be so interesting to have a way to track that because here in Vermont, we have this certified organic farm, but across the road from us, it's another farmer's land that leases it to a conventional dairy and they spray
Right.
glyphosate on their GMO corn. And so, I saw the trucks
Sure.
roll in and I quickly hightailed it back up to the house. But
Right.
it would be very interesting if I was able to click something that showed, oh, they're spraying pesticides right near me.
Well, I do think so. From a technology perspective, I think that's one of the things that really, when I started, because my background is health IT, and I've been doing a lot of work around electronic health records and just how do we implement technology effectively in healthcare to actually move the needle with patients, right? And so that's always been kind of my orientation. So when I started Daily Breath, I saw the digital health coming. I saw the big data and AI and machine learning coming. But now you've got the wearables. So you've got the IoT equation that makes the data more personal and more relevant. You've got geo mapping. One of the unique features in the app is this crowdsourcing of symptoms and my symptoms, right? There's a my symptoms map. So you actually can know, oh, here's where I'm going in the community and experiencing symptoms, right? So that becomes another risk variable for you. I know the what, now I know the where, right? And so that's a very interesting thing that for you to know from a standpoint of preparation, right? Oh, well, if you have to go to that park all the time, at least be aware that you're having symptoms there, right? But the other thing that I think is fascinating with mapping, and we're just getting into this. So the new version that I'm having come out is actually going to take the symptom maps and put the air quality heat map overlay. So you're going to be able to see your symptoms and those community symptoms in the context of air quality in your community.
Oh, that'd be
So
really useful.
and that becomes really relevant. The other thing that we're starting to do with that is then we're going, okay, well, if you want to label a favorite location and you label your school, the school's labeled. So the school is labeled, and it's actually now, once we have it stored in the database, we actually can go, okay, well, wait a second. Now, based on the air quality heat map overlay, I can see when your zone is suddenly the school is in the red, and I can provide you a school based alert. So now it's not necessarily, oh, it's an AQI alert. It's basically, no, your school is a place of vulnerability, right?
So it kind of
So
can
that's
give the
really
hot
interesting.
spots and let people know about it. So how do you go from that to like, what are some tips that you have been able to offer people as you've been
Well,
developing this?
that kind of comes back to the daily breath, the recommendations that are in the daily breath forecast, right? It wasn't just enough to say, here are the variables. It was actually, here are the impacts and here are the recommendations. We do basic things like different behavior things like, oh, air quality is going to go worse later in the day. So you might want to take your run this morning, right? Those kinds of things. You're trying to motivate behavior change. And we have some features that down the pike that I think are really going to be powerful. Like when we take that air quality heat map overlay, we're going to be able to actually begin to start to put, give me your starting destination and give me your ending destination. You want to go to that park down the street, right? Okay. If you give me that destination, I can show you the clearest route. Okay. Or I can show you a park that's in a different direction that has cleaner air. Right. So you're actually giving people the opportunity to change their behaviors. So that's the
Interesting.
first step. And then the second step is really these things like I'm describing, which is like a wearable air purifier. I think that it's challenging at times because I don't like to scare people. But I sometimes go to the worst case scenario. Let's presume, for example, that wildfire smoke is going to be a recurring phenomena every year, right? So how do we actually protect our health in those types of environments? If that's the equation, right? Saharan dust is another thing that comes quite frequently and more now. Now,
Oh, no
Saharan
kidding.
dust, people in Europe understand that kind of acutely because a lot of times it goes north, right? It goes across the Sahara Desert north towards Europe. But a lot of times, if the winds are westerly, they come across the Atlantic Ocean and they're so significant that the dust particulates are present in Southeast United States, Florida, over to Texas, New Orleans, that area. And again, if the air quality is maybe 50, 60 normally, it's maybe 80, 90 with the Saharan dust,
And is
right?
that something people can see, the Saharan dust?
No,
No,
no.
it's not
Now,
visible to the naked eye.
your point, is it maybe a little bit hazier around that sunset? Potentially, right? That might be the only indicator that there's a Saharan dust event. But the one thing that, again, going back to those mapping features, I want to do two things. One is you have daily pollution all the time. There's no doubt that that's present, right? But the reality is wildfire smoke and things like Saharan dust storms, all these types of things, they're dynamic. They're basically influenced by prevailing winds and currents, right? And so if we can start to basically dynamically track those things, then I want to be able to do that via the map. I want to be able to indicate to you when the pollution is not just a product of daily pollution, but it's an incidental event that may raise your level of risk.
Yeah, that makes me think of I remember hearing that the power plants in the Midwest, that pollutant those pollutants can fly over to the Northeast through wind currents and all that kind of stuff. And I would imagine stronger storms probably kick up things more. I had another thought. Oh, one of the tips that I tend to do is close my windows during those wildfire
Okay.
events just to keep that out of my indoor air. And I
Yeah.
actually have made a little indoor air purifier with a box fan and 4 HVAC
Uh-huh.
filters. Yeah, it's pretty
Air
cool.
filter.
Those particular filters filter out quite a lot of stuff. And if you create the 4 walls of them and duct tape it to your fan with the fan faced up, then it's drawing
Mhm.
the air in your home through those filters and then up out the fan, which is kind of neat. And
Yeah.
I think I
Yeah.
made it for less than $100.
Yeah, that's great. There's a lot of talk about that nowadays, obviously in underserved communities and stuff like that. So that's a big variable.
Yeah, the whole underserved communities, because early on, I went to a clean water action conference in the Midwest, and I was just so heartbroken to see all of these women from Mississippi, Louisiana, all these different places that lived in what was considered Cancer Alley. And they have
Mm.
so little ability to advocate for themselves, and they really need other people, other nonprofits to help them ideally change things so that they're not locating all of these different polluting factories and manufacturing facilities in areas with people who have the least.
You hit, again, going back to the mapping features, I haven't gone this far, but because we have a platform, right? We have this massive platform. There's a lot of different ways we can deliver mapping capabilities and mapping features. Can you identify methane places, right? So landfills, 2,600 landfills in the US, right? Can you identify landfills? How are those impacting people with dynamic winds or prevailing winds, right? The latest thing coming out is now data centers. What's the pollution around data centers? So there are a lot of opportunities. And again, I'm trying to be a little bit careful about I want to do these things, but I don't want them to be instruments necessarily for just policy and regulatory action. From my perspective, it's like I'm trying to inform the public on a personal level to understand the impacts on their health and actually have that move the needle when it comes to the medical community. It bothers me to a certain extent that society generally can motivate medical practitioners for climate change policy and action, right? But I can't get them to practice medicine in a way that incorporates environmental health,
Yeah,
right?
I think that
Make
that's
it
a
more
challenge
functional.
that I keep hearing over and over again with people who have been trained as Western medical doctors that have then moved into the holistic or functional medicine realms.
Right.
And the training is so focused on diagnosing symptoms and treating them with pharmaceuticals mostly, and
Right.
occasionally surgery and other types of interventions, but very little time has been spent on looking at what's causing the problem. And so in this
Right.
case, you described at the beginning too, somebody has asthma, they're given an inhaler, but that's about it, right? There's not a whole lot else that's been communicated to them about what they can do to protect themselves. And it must be terrifying to basically walk through life not knowing whether you're going to be triggered into an asthma attack, which is clearly life threatening, like that poor 2 year old and the 15-year-old. She wasn't breathing for 20 minutes or she was unconscious.
Yeah.
Yikes. Yeah.
Unconscious. Yeah.
So we have to do better.
Yeah, no, we do need to do better. And I think the interesting thing is there's been a lot of development recently about mold. There's a company out there called Mold Co. But again, it's interesting because that's been the lightning rod for people beginning to understand that something's going on that should be, right? And we need to investigate deeper to understand that. And it's like there's a correlation there between mold and air quality. Air quality is probably having as significant an impact, and you need to think strategically from a health perspective, the same way those people who are responding to mold.
A lot of people don't even know they have mold in their homes. I interviewed a young
Right.
couple, and this young woman was very healthy and fit and didn't eat the best diet back then. She just had kind of a
Right.
mainstream diet, and she kept getting these terrible symptoms. I mean, just throwing up constantly. Finally, they figured out that there was a toxic mold in their apartment on top of some other environmental exposures. And once she got out of
Right.
there and then cleaned up her diet, and they did this whole juicing protocol and got rid of all the toxic household products and that kind of stuff. And that made a huge difference. But how many people are living in apartments or houses and don't even realize that there's mold?
Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I do think that's a big issue going back to the underserved communities. These are all going to be more challenging, right? If we deal with a changing climate and you've got more extreme precipitation events, you've got more hurricanes, all of these types of different things,
Right. And
people don't
flooding of people's homes is
flooding.
going to create,
Absolutely.
damp, moldy
Absolutely.
basements. And oh gosh, yeah.
And this is becoming much more of an extreme event issue. I mean, you're seeing the government respond differently. I was involved. I can't remember. It was Puerto Rico. I can't remember what hurricane it was, but we were trying to develop some emergency materials that we could provide in Spanish specifically so that when people went back into their homes, they were aware of the mold issue, right? So when they were going back in homes, they didn't just start tossing stuff up, and whether they were children or elderly or even these vulnerable people who had asthma and COPD, they were going back into these homes and they had to clean them out and they had to deal with all of these things. Just that cleanup is life
Oh, it's
threatening potentially.
overwhelming, right? Because if they're doing the work to clean up the mold, they're being exposed to it in large quantities.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
tricky.
Yeah. So I do think we're experiencing it every day, but we're also experiencing these incidental events that are more life threatening as well. It's a huge opportunity. I'm glad that the market is finally kind of aware of it in a way that we can match kind of the problem with the solution fits that hopefully Daily Breath provides.
That's great. And so, Eric, if somebody wanted to get in touch, how do they find you?
Sure. So the website is www.dailybreath.com. I encourage everybody to download the app. We do have a new premium paid version coming out soon. It's going to be discounted for $1 a month, $10 a year.
Wow,
You
that's
get the
really reasonable.
premium version of the app, but that's available on the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. They can email me at eric@dailybreath.com. I think one of the things, and I'm involved in this organization called the Air Quality Communications Network, because I think that's been the fundamental question. I have an app where I'm trying to communicate risk, and that's one of the big things that this group is trying to grapple with. What is the challenge here? I was talking to an asthma patient in Canada, and they said, ultimately, these numbers don't mean anything to the average person. And that's the biggest struggle. I need something that I can understand is relevant to me and that's actionable.
It's a lot of sense because when I see the air index numbers, I'm like, okay, so what does that mean? And what do I do about it?
Right. Exactly, exactly. I think that that's what I keep hoping is that we can start this journey of really feedback and discovery, right? That's what the app is. Put it out there, get people's response to it. How can it help you be more actionable on a daily basis?
That's great. Well, Eric, thank you so much. I think this has been a very helpful conversation, particularly for people that have any kind of asthma, allergies, COPD, or just want to be more aware. So
Terrific. I really appreciate this opportunity. Great discussion.